Hi, this is Bruce Rawles, and I'm speaking again with Dr. Bob Rosenthal, who's one of the co-presidents of the Foundation for Inner Peace, and the author of another wonderful book, which we've been already talking in previous conversations, which is From Nevermind to Evermind. And in our last conversation, we very briefly talked about all the wonderful content in the first chapter, and now we're forging ahead into chapter 2, which is Believing is Seeing. And I had fun rereading a good part of this today, and took some notes of things that I found really helpful. One of them was the context and contrast ideas that begins the chapter. So do you have first of all, any announcements or any opening remarks to make as we continue the conversation?
Yeah, let's just sort of frame it or preface it in this way, because these interviews with you are giving me this wonderful opportunity to reread what I read. And people may not realize, but as an author, when you're deep in the writing process, you have a very different perspective. So in a very real way, reading the book as a book, and as a reader, is a profound shift in perception from writing it.
Mm-hmm.
And what was brought home to me even more forcefully, both when I read chapter 1 and in reading chapter 2, is that coming to the book as an established Course in Miracles student, people might feel like, well, wait a minute, is this really a Course in Miracles? And so I want to make very clear what my goal was to work from where we are here in the world of form and start with sort of the ego's givens, if you will, and begin to dissolve them away, begin to sort of soak them in some alcohol or ether or some powerful solvent that allows us to begin to see just how flimsy and porous the ego's world is. Because we put it together in a way where it looks really, definitive and sound and structured. And sure, I mean, if someone slips 400 micrograms of LSD in your drink, you'll see how liquid and fluid the world really is. But that's not an experience most of us want, at least not involuntarily. So if you're reading the book as a course student, enjoy the course quotes, but stay with the ride, because I do believe, even for myself, that it will take you on a journey that by chapter 5 at least, you'll have a better insight and a more practical one into what the Course is trying to do for us. So yeah, in rereading it, I was like, well, yeah, this is so different from so many books about the Course, including some really outstanding books about the Course, that I think that kind of, preface, that frame for reading it and understanding it might be good for our talks here as well.
Mm-hmm. It really is, and it fits perfectly with the opening. One of the opening ideas, which is context, is to have that bigger picture, and the bigger picture, of course, is that we are, for all intents and purposes, as a first approximation, completely clueless in this world as to what reality is. I was reminded of that. One of the images that came to mind while I was rereading that second chapter was a cartoon that I saw years ago. If I ever run across it, I'll have to scan it and send everybody a copy. But it was basically these two guys out in the desert in a Jeep, and the cartoon is zoomed way down, like 70,000 foot view of these guys in a Jeep, and all you see is just just the very small outlines of these two figures in this little tiny Jeep in this much larger panoramic vista, bird's eye panorama. And the caption is, one guy says to the others, yeah, another one of those wild, rumors that were sent out to investigate, something like that. And what they don't see is that they're driving within a footprint of what looks like, maybe a dinosaur or some large monster that's like probably 3/4 of a mile across. And because it's so large, they don't have the context. They don't see the
That's
big picture.
rich. That's beautiful.
Yeah, yeah, and I just thought that's kind of describes our perspective of things. Maybe not the noir version so much is intentionally, but the idea that we just are basically clueless, and
We're
I
lost
love.
in the ego's footprint.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. And I love what you put on, one of my favorite quotes from the course, all told, is the one on page 95, which, if you don't mind, I'll just read out loud.
No, go ahead,
Okay,
please.
because I think this really sums up so beautifully how
Oh,
we
yes.
need the greater context. Okay, the aim of our curriculum, unlike the goal of the world's learning, is the recognition that judgment in the usual sense is impossible. This is not an opinion, but a fact. In order to judge anything rightly, one would have to be fully aware of an inconceivably wide range of things, past, present, and to come. One would have to recognize in advance all the effects of his judgments on everyone and everything involved in them in any way. And one would have to be certain there is no distortion in his perception, so that his judgment would be wholly fair to everyone on whom it rests now and in the future. Who is in a position to do this? Who, except in grandiose fantasies, would claim this for himself? Remember how many times you thought you knew all the, quote, facts, unquote, you needed for judgment, and how wrong you were. Is there anyone who has not had this experience? Would you know how many times you merely thought you were right without ever realizing you were wrong? Would you choose such an arbitrary basis for decision making? Wisdom is not judgment, it is the relinquishment of judgment. So anyway, I think that is a great preface for looking at
Yes.
our very, very finite view of the world. And I'm also reminded of the idea of, just in terms of our physical sensory data, which of course tells us, the Course in Miracles tells us is basically looking at feedback from an illusion that we made up and forgot that we made up. But even within that context,
Right.
we see, perhaps one octave of the electromagnetic spectrum, from red through orange, yellow, green, violet, so forth. And we're, for the most part, other than instrumentation that we've developed, oblivious of from everything from the electromagnetic spectrum of infrared through microwaves and radio waves, on down to who knows how far, super
Yeah.
low frequencies, and then through ultraviolet, through X-rays, to cosmic rays, to who knows how far in the other direction. And that's just within the realm of the context of the space-time, science
Exactly.
that we've made up. And that's just one octave out of however many, large number of octaves of electromagnetic energy. And then acoustically, we hear maybe 10 octaves, if our hearing's still, reasonably okay. Uh, and out of who knows how, the same number of octaves of acoustic energy, just our two primary senses. And then, if we take good care of our bodies, we might have a century out of, billions of years of past and future within the
Mm-hmm.
context of the space-time dream as we think of it, from which to draw conclusions. And we occupy, with a generous room for padding, a couple of cubic meters of space out of a pretty large cosmic arena. you know
Yes.
and we think we have clues about things. They're arrogant enough to think that we have some kind of idea about how things are. And
We kid ourselves that we have quote unquote good judgment.
yeah, exactly. So anyway, I
Yeah,
really
I
enjoyed all the analogies and stories that you told about, like your the football Nazi story, and that was.
communist, not Nazi.
Oh, okay. Well, anyway, it was.
Yeah.
I thought it was just kind of a, the. Um, Thank you for that clarification. I thought it was just an interesting example of how, you see something out of context, and you think, oh well, there must be a tremendous poverty. I mean, it's got to be a lot worse than where I'm at, and not realizing it was, a bunch of people piling on each other for a
Yeah,
football.
let me tell that story because
Sure.
it's sort of a nice intro. I mean, I opened the chapter with this because it had such a strong impression on me. So, in brief, my grandfather immigrated to the U.S. from Russia, or actually what was then the Soviet Union, in
Right.
1922. He lived through the Bolshevik Revolution. And he was a guy, I mean, he had some great stories, and he was really almost a saint. He was beloved by many, many thousands of people. But he told this story how after the revolution of 1917, at some point, in order to make the point to the people of just how horrible conditions were in the capitalist countries, and by contrast, how well they were in Russia, they screened a film showing people chasing after a loaf of bread and trying to kill each other, you know, jumping on each other and shoving to get to this loaf of bread. And of course, he and everyone else thought, that's really horrible. I mean, you know, we have it good here in Russia. But nonetheless, he, you know, traveled through Europe and eventually made his way to the U.S., fully believing that he would return to Russia one day, which never did happen because of the Nazis and the concentration camps. But when he got here, eventually he started seeing movies, and in one of the movies he saw a sports reel of a football game and watched a bunch of football players chase after a fumbled ball and pile on each other and grab it, and realized that what they had shown him was a sports reel of a football game stripped of all context and given a new context. See, they're chasing after a loaf of bread. And, you know, of course he started laughing, but I think it's a beautiful example of how we are influenced by the context that we're given. And this happens all the time. I had something happen to me in medical school that was extremely embarrassing at the time, but it's a great personal example of this same kind of thing. There was a woman I had been sort of half involved with. She was, you know, kind of in and out of the relationship and had some difficulties in her past that made her question whether she was ready for any relationship. And I had invited her to join me for, I don't even remember what it was, probably something at the Philadelphia Orchestra. And she'd said no, and it was like, okay. And then I invited someone else and left a message. And at some point I got a phone call back, and I was so focused on this girl that I was, you know, attracted to and enamored of, that I kind of half forgot or went into denial that I'd called someone else about it who was just a regular friend. And I'm talking on the phone, and I'm like, oh, I'm so glad she changed her mind. I'm thinking, it's like, well, why don't we meet at, you know, thus and such a point, and I'll see you then, and we'll go to the show. And I was like, oh, great. I'll, you know, the one I liked, her name was Jane. The other one was Linda. And so I hung up the phone from Jane, so happy she had changed her mind, and called Linda back and said, you know, things have changed. Yeah, I'm going to withdraw my invite to this event, and we'll do something else sometime. And I go to the rendezvous spot, and I'm waiting, and it's winter in Philadelphia. It's cold. I'm like this. And I'm like, what the heck happened? Jane's not showing up. And finally, you know, I give up. I think I waited like almost an hour because that's what young men will do for love. And I get back and I call Jane, and I'm like, what happened? I was waiting for you. And she's just totally puzzled. She's like, huh? She said, I told you I couldn't go. And all of a sudden it dawned on me that it was Linda who called me back and made the arrangements. And then like a putz, I called her and immediately canceled on her. And when I apologized and explained, she said, yeah, I thought that was rather strange. But my context was, I want to go out with Jane. And so I heard it the way I wanted to see it. You know, the Course tells us desire makes perception, not creates, because we don't use that word for the world of form. But it's another example of how if you go in expecting to see something, you will see it. Mm-hmm. You know, there have been psychological studies done of sports matches, football games in particular, where people rooting for one team see a very different game than people rooting for the other. The referees make the terrible calls against their team, but the good ones against the other. And of course, if you're rooting for the other team, you see it completely the opposite. Perception is hardly accurate or factual. And this is why that section you read from the Manual for Teachers, section 10, is just, I agree with you. It's one of my favorite sections of A Course in Miracles. It's a cornerstone of it. So what I wanted to convey in this section is not going right to the heart of what the Course is telling us, that perception itself is a complete trick and doesn't even exist, but starting where we think we live. Oh yeah, this is all real, and my clock is running, and it's 9 o'clock, and that means I need to be at work, and it's 5 o'clock, and now I'm free, and I smell my coffee in the morning, etc. That whole world is like this construction of flotsam and jetsam that we put together and assign all of the meaning to. It doesn't have any intrinsic meaning. I have given what I see all the meaning that it has for me, and that we assign that meaning based on our experience of the past, when that too is completely an illusion. And I'm writing about that more in the next book, which is about relationships and forgiveness. But forgiveness at its ultimate level also is about forgiving the whole world of perception. So there's a lot of intersection here. And hopefully we'll do this when the next book comes out. Its title will be From Loving One to One Love, Transforming Relationship Through A Course in Miracles.
Nice.
And we'll be talking a little about special relationships in that one, I think.
I can imagine.
Yeah. But yeah, when we start to penetrate the illusions of perception, it can be a little bit uncomfortable. Actually, it can be a lot uncomfortable. But I think it allows us to escape from this rigid, I know what I'm seeing, I know what that person did to me, I know what happened in my past, and allow us, as I said, to just sort of dissolve it away in, how to put it, in the holiness of not knowing, in the recognition that, as one person in our Course in Miracles groups likes to say, we don't know shit from Shinola. I mean, old expression. Shinola apparently was black shoe polish. We don't really know anything.
Yep.
And if we think we do, we know even less, because now we've put something artificial in place of a confusion that could lead to reality.
And we set it up for ourselves, as the Course reminds us. We made up this world to be a convincing holographic hoax, and it's this 3D moving projection, a holographic projection, that photorealistic, high resolution quality, and we have no reason to question it. I mean, just it seems so real. It's got all the hallmarks of something that's very authentic, and if you're convinced, like you talk about in writing in this chapter about the Matrix movie, so why would we question it if it seems so real? I mean, it very few actually question the very foundation, and the very, in a sense, use another metaphor, the jurisdiction, that we could throw the thing out of court if we change to the correct jurisdiction. Well, the ego's law is always one of punitive nature, and the Holy Spirit's laws is always one of forgiveness and seeing the innocence beyond the form. And I had an interesting experience the other day. I don't know if you happened to catch the State of the Union address and the rebuttal.
Parts of it.
Yeah. I had this sort of aha moment, because I was sort of, going into it with the idea of, okay, Holy Spirit, how would you see this? Different from how I normally see this, because I watch all those comic pundit shows like Colbert and Trevor Noah and all that kind of fun stuff.
John Oliver.
Exactly, all those kind of things are just kind of fun to not take the craziness of the world so seriously. And at the same time, it's real easy to kind of get drawn into the idea of good, bad, and right, wrong, and even if you're consciously reminding yourself as often as you can, it's like, well, we're all working with the same ingredients. We all have as I think as Ken Wapnick pointed out, with the decision making faculty, and then the two thought systems that we vacillate between with that decision making faculty, and we go between ego and Holy Spirit back and forth all the time.
Right-minded, wrong-minded.
Exactly, yeah. And and that we're all in that same boat, and we all deserve compassion and forgiveness. But it's easy to kind of get swept up when there's all these, factors that contribute to, well, let's see, this obviously is, this horrific thing that's happened, and here's the guilty party, and here's the innocent victims, and yet on some level, the Course reminds us that we're all complicit in the making of the dream, and to the degree that we want to persecute, not on the level of form, but in terms of the spirit of the essence, and condemn the identity of those that we see. We're kind of going against what the Course is suggesting. So I was watching, and I think, again, the context was really helpful, because a lot of these individual people that you see on news broadcasts, who are brought up, essentially for their crimes one at a time, paraded across the news media. This person said this, and this person tweeted that, and this person did this, but I saw, there's hundreds of people assembled for this, ironically, State of the Union address. And I was thinking, well, from the ego's perspective, talk about a poster child of disunity.
Disunion, yes.
But it was interesting to see, wow, here's all these seeming individuals that are no different from you or I in truth. On the level of form, sure, plenty of differences. But on the level of truth, we're all working with those same three components, the two thought systems and the decision-making faculty that vacillates between the two of them. And we all have the opportunity to see through the form to the content of the mind, and see that the underlying identity is really ultimately one of innocence. But the context was different. The context and the contrast between the different ideologies was obviously present on the level of form, but when I kind of backed up, I was thinking, well, gee, each person in that room, to the degree that they're wanting to fight for their side, the sides of the aisle, so to speak, we're in the same boat. And to the degree that I wanted to demonize demonizers, or to see that as an important difference in anyone, and look at my own biases, it's like, oh, we're all in the same boat. We all merit the same assessment, which is complete innocence and truth. And anyway, it's just kind of an interesting exercise. And I think that what you point out in this chapter about the center focus and then the background for contrast, I was thinking, well, the center focus of the Holy Spirit is always forgiveness. And then the background for contrast is really looking at ego's very unsatisfying assessment of everything. And anyway.
I think I had a section in there called Ultimate Context. And
yes.
And I think the idea there is, and this then gets carried through to not the next chapter, but to chapter 4 in a lot of ways, but that any context that we apply within the world of form can be valuable to the extent that it allows us to see ourselves and our brothers in a more loving way.
Exactly.
So even though I completely agree with you that within the world of form, we are all lost. We are all bozos on this bus, so to speak. And to be righteously certain that your view is better than someone else's is an ego trap, because immediately you have defined them as separate from you. You have defined yourself as superior. And we know that even if you deign to understand them, you're still practicing what Song of Prayer calls forgiveness to destroy. So that's true. But I also look at it as, does this particular frame within the world of form allow me to be more loving, or does it make me more angry? Now, it gets tricky, because if I'm watching my favorite news show and I find myself going, oh my God, I can't stand that person, look what they're doing, then that's actually not terribly helpful. On the other hand, if I'm trying to choose between going to a meeting of the Tea Party where it's all anger and those other people are attacking us, versus I want to go to the soup kitchen and help feed people who are in trouble, regardless of their skin color or where they came from, that moves me more towards love. But the moment I start to feel self-righteous about it, I'm in an ego trap again.
Exactly.
So it is a real conundrum. And, you know, because we don't know the big picture, back to what you read about judgment, we have no idea what anything's for. So at the deepest level, when I check in with Holy Spirit, I really believe that sometimes within the world of perception, things have to appear to get worse in order for us to have more of a chance of seeing our own judgments and our ego traps and waking up. Is this not what happened with Helen Schuckman and Bill Thetford? They were in an absolutely poisonous environment at Columbia Law School. I mean, I remember, I knew Bill fairly well, and we would talk about some of the personalities at Columbia, especially after I was in medical school and residency, and actually had read papers by some of his colleagues and knew who these folks were. And he would describe these horrifically toxic interactions, and the backbiting, and so that said, and I'm sorry, no matter if it gets worse, that may be the pathway to getting better. And who are you to judge for another human being whether that is their best path or not, much less for an entire country? I mean, there are alcoholics who had to get that DUI, or worst case scenario, maybe even killed somebody in order to go, oh my God, look at the path I'm on, and shift and do better later. Does that excuse what happened? I'm not in a position to say. If I was talking to someone who lost a child to a drunk driver, I would never say, well, think about their path, because that's not what's helpful. I would ask Holy Spirit, what do I say in that context? But we can't judge. And in the biggest picture, where I started here, is this ultimate context. The ultimate context is the Holy Spirit, because he's holding what I called in chapter 1, the OS1 perspective, the operating system of God, which is it's all one all the time. And you can't please any of the people because there are no separate people. We're all in joy, bliss, constantly expanding into our creations. And by the way, I don't think that's something that any human being can understand unless you've had like a full-on blow-away mystical experience, and even then you probably only get a taste of it. And we'll talk about that in our next talk.
Sounds good. I was chuckling for a moment there when you said all one all the time. I was thinking that'd be a great non-dual radio jingle, or a slogan.
Wouldn't it? Yes, it would. All one all the time. Or all one, no time.
There you go. Exactly. Outside of time.
Yeah. But so wherever you are, when we run up against problems, what the Course is asking us to do really is take it to that ultimate context of the Holy Spirit. One other thought, in the practice section of this chapter, which I'm actually quite proud of, I ask people to go through exercises, taking not a personal event, but a global event. I'm watching the State of the Union. I'm hearing about walls. I'm reading about a plane crash and how Boeing never informed pilots that they changed the software on, this was with the crash of an Indonesian airliner. Things that for the majority of human beings make you upset or angry. And I ask, well, let's change the context. If you heard about this on the day that your child was born, how would it feel? If you heard about this and you had 2 days left to live, how would it feel? If you heard about it and you knew someone who died in that plane crash, how would it feel? Just to start playing with context in our own minds, to be able to expose and surface the lies we tell ourselves, because they are lies, so that we're not quite so certain about it. And that then makes it easier to open the door to Holy Spirit, and, say one of my favorite prayers from the text, I do not understand what anything including this means, and so I will not use my own past learning as the light to guide me now. And so I do not know how to respond to it, and I will not use my own past learning as the light to guide me now. Page 298 of the text. That's where we want to go with it, because the moment we aren't certain, now we can open up and say, help me to see this differently. You judge it for me, because that's the ultimate context, and then deliver to me the shift in perception that will help me to see it differently. And when we're doing that, we're practicing forgiveness.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. It's kind of like, we don't really get usually the big picture, but we get just enough context when we ask for help from Holy Spirit to certainly let go of our misperceptions enough to see things differently. I was as you were speaking, I was reminding of the anecdote you gave about the professor who wanted to give his talk, and the young woman kept raising her hand, and he only learned in retrospect that that this was the last couple of days that she had in her life, and she really wanted to attend his class, because of the importance of what he was sharing, apparently something like that. And maybe you could elaborate on that. So
this was something that someone shared in a Course in Miracles group, and I actually worked my butt off trying to track them down and get their name, and ultimately couldn't, and decided I'm using the story anyway, because it was just such a great example of the judgments that we all hold and apply and do it quite naturally. So this, in short, this was a professor at a prestigious college teaching an undergraduate lecture course. So big hall, figure 150, 200 people. And one day a young woman appears in the front row, and something seems a little off about her, and he's giving his lecture. And at a certain point she raises her hand and she's waving it, and he ignores her because it's a lecture course. You don't ask questions till the end, and then you come up and ask them privately of the professor. And she just won't be deterred. She's waving her hand, and finally he calls on her, and she asks a question, and he answers it, and he goes on, and 15 minutes later she does it again, and he's really kind of pissed off, but doesn't want to express that anger in front of the class. He actually intends to say something after the class, but she's gone. She flees so fast he can't say anything. And the next class, the same thing happens. And the next class, the same thing happens. And, as with all of us, he starts getting used to it. Yeah, it's rude, should never be happening, but he's no longer taking it as a personal affront. It's like, okay, this person never learned manners. And then one day she's not there in the front row, and he almost found himself a little disappointed. Talk about changing context. And the next class she's not there again, so he decided to make some inquiries, like, who was this person and what happened? Mm-hmm. And he learned that this was a young woman who wanted desperately to audit his course. And the reason she did is she had a terminal illness and was in the final months or weeks of it, apparently. And so whoever assigns the courses let her audit. And the reason she didn't come back was she'd finally died. And of course, his whole sense of it changed. I mean, when I heard the story, I almost started crying, because it's one of those where, it turns completely on its head. Mm-hmm. From this rude person, and how narcissistic and self-centered that she's doing this. And it's kind of like, well, if you've only got a couple weeks left, maybe you have a right to be a little narcissistic and self-centered and get what you want. Our judgments can't apply. We don't know what's going on. And following on that, I took an example from one of Jerry Jampolsky's books, Love is Letting Go of Fear, I think it was, where he talked about, getting poor service from a waiter in a restaurant, mm-hmm. and saying, but you don't know what, maybe that waiter just learned that his mother died. And it's like, yeah, maybe, or maybe the waiter's sick and, has to work in order to, pay the rent. Or maybe the person on the freeway who cuts you off and, zips off the exit isn't just an entitled a-hole. Maybe they're rushing to pick up their kid at school because they just had an accident, or get to the hospital because their kid just had an accident. We don't know. And sometimes we get these lessons like this professor did and shared it because we can all benefit so richly from it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I love that story.
As you were sharing that, it kind of reminded me of an experience I had with, we went to Egypt, gosh, over a quarter century ago, and we had the privilege of listening to an Egyptologist named John Anthony West, who was describing an experiment he did with a well-respected geologist named Robert Schoch. And what he did is he took a photo of the hindquarters of the Great Sphinx, which was heavily eroded, and he masked it off so you couldn't tell that it was the Sphinx. And so you just saw this kind of abstract looking wall sort of a thing, this structure. But he showed it to this geologist, and he said, "What do you think caused this pattern?" He says, "Well, undoubtedly, many millennia of water erosion, and of course that hasn't happened for many thousands of years in Egypt." Yeah, and it basically totally upset the apple cart in terms of the conventional dynastic historical view. And so when he unmasked the photo, he said, "Oh," because he immediately knew the implications of what he was sharing was not going to fly well with the conventional historians of that region, and but it was an interesting trick. But
and
I think
Edgar Cayce says the Sphinx is much older than we think. That
exactly.
The Sphinx goes back like 10,000 years to a time when Egypt was tropical.
Exactly. So anyway,
that's
that was
a great story.
Yeah, and another example of how we intentionally zoom in on just a little bit of things, and we miss the context.
Yeah, there's a game that I used to play with my kids where one of the tasks was they had pictures of common everyday objects that were enlarged so much that they were completely stripped of context, and you had to try to figure out what it was. So, for example, a button that was so enlarged that you only saw one little hole of it and maybe a tiny bit of the edge, and they were very hard to guess. Although my daughter had this phenomenal knack for, oh no, that's this and that's that. But we don't know. I was thinking about back to the professor story just for a second. It's not just an example of how our judgments don't work. It's also an example, to me, of how forgiveness works, and that shift in perception. So the shift in perception can come from the Holy Spirit, but to me, this is one of the things I'm working on now in this second book. It also can come from new information, where we think we see one thing and then we get new information and we learn that we were wrong. I give another example in this chapter where I was judging another psychotherapist who, I had a patient telling me that this person was extremely uncomfortable at what they shared about past childhood sexual abuse. And in my mind, I was like, she has a good reputation, this therapist, but I guess, maybe she's got some ghosts in her closet. And then later on, I find out the reason this person thought she was uncomfortable because, he tells this story and she gets up out of her chair and she's pacing and looking sort of pained and distracted. And, months later, I'm having lunch with a different colleague and we're just shooting the breeze and he brings up this therapist's name. And, mentally I'm like, oh, her, well, I know things about her that I can't tell you. And he shares with me that she had terrible back surgery and has been in pain and is thinking about, like leaving her practice, and she won't take painkillers during session because she doesn't want to be impaired for her patients. And my whole viewpoint goes, whoops. Like, wow, she's a hero, and I was sucked in by the misperception of my own patient. But this happens all the time. So even with the professor, he had a shift in perception that happened gradually as he got used to her. But then when she disappeared and he made inquiries and he discovers, oh my God, that's why she was here, suddenly the love gets to flow.
Exactly. Yeah.
That's what it's all about.
Yeah, I was thinking the tolerance and the compassion and the forgiveness, tends to increase as we expand our worldview and our identity, doesn't it? I mean,
Yes, it does. And as we let go of judgments.
exactly. Yeah. Another really, I think, super helpful idea in this second chapter is the idea of macros. And I was just making a few notes of
a computer guy would obviously love
well,
macros.
I just think it's really kind of cool. I mean, to use Byron Katie's thing of turning it around, I think, Holy Spirit allows us to do that by just kind of looking at our knee-jerk reactions in slow motion and seeing how we've made these associations and patterns. And, just we practice these things in our minds so, meticulously. And I think, of course, it actually even suggests that, we've our mind's incredibly powerful, but we've degraded and basically dismissed that power. And the beginning, somewhere in the beginning of the text, he says, if I were to dismiss that power, the power of your mind to choose, I would be violating the law of cause and effect.
Yeah.
But we have this enormous power. We made up a whole universe to hide from a misunderstanding. And so we have to undo the misunderstanding by breaking down those macros. So I really like that.
That's good.
That idea, because it basically, if we just kind of look in slow motion and say, well, I made this assumption, which then triggered that memory, which then reinforced this misinterpretation, and then you kind of string those all together, and you get these habit patterns, and and so much of the course is repetitious, because I think it's attempting to see the undo process from all these different angles and dissolve the bonds of the macros by pulling them apart and letting us see, oh, well, that's not valid. And if that's not valid,
right.
I can take all these little syllogisms that the ego made that are based on incorrect data and pull them apart and say, well, if that's not true, then all these other conclusions I've drawn based on that very myopic view of things, they must be bogus as well.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm sure you probably have lots of things to say about
does everyone know
macros.
what I don't, in case someone doesn't know what a macro is, it's an operation where it's a computer term for stringing together a number of operations that you execute in sequence so frequently that you don't want to have to go through all the stages. Think of it as speed dialing on your phone. Rather than punching in each number separately every time, you hit one button and it does the whole 10, 11 digit string at once. So the idea here is that perception and interpretation become macros, that we see one thing and we learn, this is how we learn. I think one of the examples I give for perception is just, at a very early age, you learn that, forelegs and barking and tail wagging equals dog. And as you apply that, you don't need to say, oh, let's see, well, 1, 2, 3, 4 legs. Is it barking or is it meowing or, is it talking? No, it's barking. You don't have to assess each operation separately. You just sort of co-assemble these, and that becomes dog, and it's abstract enough that you can apply it, whether it's a little yappy chihuahua or a huge mastiff that's, it's still barky, 4 legs, tail. So, but I offer it because where I want to go in this book, and I don't know that I even make it all the way there, but I hopefully in the one I'm writing now I will go all the way there. Is I think we all tend to soft pedal the course. We all agree it's pretty radical, but we don't want to stare at the vastness of just how radical it is when we think that we really are in the matrix, that the entire world of perception is an illusion, a vast illusion perpetrated by us as a collective and maintained by us as individuals. That's just so hard to do. So one of my goals was to come at this from the perspective of neurobiology and neuroscience and literally deconstruct it to say, no, even from the scientific standpoint, you're not seeing what you think you're seeing. You know, the cells in your retina are responding to patterns of edge recognition and shape recognition. The hair cells in your cochlea are registering different frequencies. But as you said earlier, Bruce, they're just a small number out of the whole vastness. That the world of perception is a construct, and you know, true confessions, I have taken psychedelic drugs. I don't do it anymore because I don't find it helpful. And if I thought I'd find it helpful, I might go back and do it again. And I have known some people in the course community, back in the day, where they didn't feel like they could break through the lock on perception, and they wanted a psychedelic experience just to see what that would be like. I think in that context, psychedelics are actually useful, but you don't need them. If you begin to practice some of this and some of the exercises at the end of chapter 2, you start to get a sense that, the world is not what we think it is. It's a lot loosey-goosey, I can't say it, loosey-goosier than that.
Uh-huh.
And that can become a little bit frightening. If someone has a propensity for psychosis, I would not recommend they do any of those exercises.
Mm-hmm.
Ironically, I used to hang out with a group of transpersonal psychologists and psychiatrists. We used to joke, you have to have an ego before you can lose your ego. And what we meant by that is, if you're just awash in a sea of scary perceptions and you don't know what they are, oh my God, is the lamp going to attack me? Is that person I just passed on the street looking at me funny? Might they come after me? You can't get to peace from that place very easily.
Mm-hmm.
It's much more helpful to first come into the matrix and go, all right, I know how this all works, before you then disassemble it and go, I don't have a clue how this works, but there's a part of my mind that I can access, OS1, Holy Spirit, that not only has a clue, it knows it inside out and upside down, and if I'm willing to let it show me, it's going to show me that better way that Bill Thetford and Helen Schuckman agreed to find. So I really am trying to make the point in a way that, that the Course would not come at, except in some of those early lessons, that, you're not seeing anything real, and you're not hearing anything real, and you're not touching anything real. When I go back now, at the beginning of this year, I decided to do the workbook lessons from 1 again. And I don't just do, nothing that I see in this room is real. I actually expand it. I go, nothing that I feel in this room is real. So I'm sitting in a chair, but the chair sensations aren't real. Nothing that I hear is real. Yeah, there are trucks outside. Maybe there's construction going on, an airplane overhead. None of those are real either. The whole fabric, as I said, it reminds me, I used to go to the beach, and a fairly deserted beach on Nantucket. And if I walked a little ways down, somebody would put together these beach sculptures that literally were just flotsam and jetsam. They'd hang a buoy here and a bunch of seaweed there, and these things that were unrelated that just the tide washed up, bottles, cushions from motorboats that washed overboard. And it was kind of like, well, that's interesting, that someone could put all these together and make a work of art. That's what we do all the time. We're making these beach structures that really have no intrinsic meaning of themselves, but we've given them that meaning. That's the matrix. That's the ego's world. That's what keeps us a prisoner.
And we assign good and bad and desirable and undesirable and all those kind of qualities and attributes.
Yeah.
That, they're just really crazy when we stop and think about it.
Yeah. Crazy, literally insane.
Yeah, exactly. Another idea I think that ties into that the macros is the habit patterns that come about, and again, those early workbook lessons are such great examples of training the mind to habitually forgive instead of habitually condemn ultimately, but the initial phases of it, like you've been pointing out, really have a lot to do with just looking and deconstructing our normal perceptual, the macros where we just jump to, well, I'm seeing this collection of objects that I assign values and meanings as objects, and therefore they have these qualities and values and preferences in my mind for things that are, to me, mean something that I want more of or less of, or all that whole gamut of stuff. And I think it's interesting if we can just kind of make habits out of questioning those evaluations and asking ourselves, do I really want to see peace, or do I want to see what ego would like to, have me struggle with, in one way or another out of things. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, what it makes me think about is some of the knee-jerk reactions that we have to things like racist comments.
Mm-hmm.
There's currently a huge controversy in the news about the governor of Virginia who put up a photo in his yearbook of someone dressed as a Ku Klux Klan member and someone in blackface standing right next to him. And it's completely out of taste. At the level of the world of form, I think, having done a medical school yearbook, you think very carefully about what you put in there. Those are representative of your values, and therefore, is this person truly capable of governing? So at that level, yeah, the judgments are there. But I think it's workbook lesson maybe 134. I might be getting it wrong, but in one of them it says, "Would I accuse myself of this?"
Mm-hmm.
And I think if we are really being fair, if you are black or brown, have you never looked at a white person and had a judgment? If you are white, have you never looked at a black or brown or tan person and had a judgment? If, as a Jew, I know plenty of Jews who, I'll never go to Germany. I love Germany. I find it an interesting culture that can produce Beethoven's Ninth Symphony and Hitler all within a century and a half of each other. But, welcome to the ego's world. So I think that even though, at the world of form, judgments get made, again, the moment we incorporate them as part of our identity and go self-righteous on it, we're lost. And so the path of forgiveness is, would I accuse myself of this? Because if I'm honest, I do have to accuse myself. When you really start to get vigilant, it's daunting, it's upsetting, it's crushing the number of judgments that you make about people in the course of a day. You get out on the freeway and the judgments
or a minute
are right.
sometimes.
Stand in the supermarket line. Oh, tall, short, fat, thin, rich, poor. They're just there. And I guess part of what I would like to convey is don't go to guilt because of it. What a terrible course student I am. Just marvel at the tenacity of the ego's world and give it to the Holy Spirit. The more aware you are of it, the easier it becomes to say, take this from me and look upon it, judging it for me. As chapter 19 of the text, the prayer says. But they're everywhere. Okay, so ultimate take home, if we approach the world as a personality, Bruce and I here, and it's like, two personalities. If you see personalities based on your own personality, you will judge. It's inevitable. You can't not, and you will use your past to judge. You'll be lost. The only way out of the conundrum is to begin to see your brother differently, to see the holiness in him or her, in order to then recognize that that same holiness lives in you and that you can free yourself. I bless the world because I bless myself. My holiness blesses the world. I mean, these lessons that are quite far apart but say the same thing.
Exactly.
So that's the work, and it's hard work, but the payoff is ultimate. The payoff is a sense of peace, joy, happiness that you don't get anywhere else. And, I have the distinct privilege and honor to spend a great deal of time with, Judy Scutch-Whitson, who at the moment is probably the longest running student of A Course in Miracles. John Mundy, I think, may have seen it around the same time. But I think Judy's been actually doing the lessons the longest. And I can see how the practice of forgiveness at this point in her life literally leads to miracles. People that I have known from her life since the time for 40 years, who I had consigned to the 9th level of hell, no hope for, the rest of the world might get forgiven, but these people, they come around. They make amazing statements. Suddenly someone who you saw as impossibly judgmental and angry or what have you is speaking the language of love. This is what happens. You change your perception, boom, the world changes and the people in it change. The Course would be completely insane if that weren't so. It'd be telling us the world isn't real, and my colleagues would want to lock me up in a psych ward. The trick is, when we apply it, it works. And if it works, then it must be true, and ipso facto, what didn't work must be false. That's the logic that I've learned to apply in any case. And, I know, Bruce, because, I think you're a wonderful example of someone who is open-minded and really applying the Course, on a constant basis. And I think it shows in your world too,
Well, I feel that it's been helpful for sure. And, when I look back of the things that used to trouble me, certainly 30, 20, even 10 years ago, and I realized, okay, there's changes happening. And I think I can attribute largely to the times I actually apply the curriculum that's suggested in the Course, and learn to not take the dream so seriously, and to be more forgiving. I was just going to conclude with one comment that I thought was interesting in the rebuttal, if you will, to the State of the Union address that the lady whose name I'm forgetting, that
Stacey Abrams.
Stacey Abrams, thank you. Yes, I liked her comment where it was basically she was willing to say, "Well, I found some of the comments that were made disappointing, but I don't want him to fail." And I thought that to me was like, wow, here's, please help my misunderstanding. Please help my judgment of being disappointed, because beneath it all, beyond it all, I really want everyone to succeed. But the ego, of course, fights against that tooth and nail. But in truth, what we all want is for everyone to be happy and to truly succeed, and to find the peace that we've hidden from ourselves for millennia, as far as we can tell.
Yeah. So, for forever.
Yeah. So,
anyway, not forever, but a long time.
A good while.
That's a lovely perspective. Yeah. I mean, it sort of goes to that, do you prefer that you be right or happy?
Exactly.
If we want happiness, and the world, and we know every single person out there wants happiness, then okay, there we go. But if we want to be right and everyone else wants to be right, well, you can see where that's going to end.
Exactly. Yeah. So Stacey's comment was, I thought, so right on, particularly that thought of, I don't want this guy to fail. Because I think in our heart of hearts, that's really where we all feel the peace, and where we all, let each other and consequently ourselves off the hook by suspending the judgments and suspending the little tunnel vision attachments, and start seeing the bigger footprints and the and the context, and then the contrast becomes a tremendous help to our journey home together. Yeah.
And we all need, I was just thinking, so what if the President of the United States had a major epiphany and completely turned around and said, I really am interested in becoming a unifier, and started calling out the dividers on both sides of the aisle and
Mm-hmm.
proposing middle of the road policies, I mean, that would be an exemplar,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
We all need I mean, this is fundamentally, Charles Dickens' A Christmas Tale, the Scrooge story, when someone who has been completely defined by ego wakes up to the idea that, either we all rise together or we all fall together. That's profound. It's uplifting. It makes us all really happy. And why not wish that for everyone?
Sure, sure. Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly.
But that's, yeah, I mean, I heard Stacey Abrams say that, and it registered at the time, but I didn't put it in the context of the course. And I think that is, it's a really good take home. And even if you're listening to this 2 years from now and the future where it all is going, which Bruce and I don't know right now, but the Holy Spirit does,
Uh-huh.
it's still a good exemplar.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. Because that's the eternal longing that we all have, and I think what's drawn all of us that are involved in A Course in Miracles to look at the contents of our mind and adopt that gentle vigilance without condemnation, and that's seems like an enormously helpful thing to help us
Indeed.
undo our identification with our own little virtual reality game that we've made up, and not take the little pieces of it quite so seriously.
Yeah, well, and that's the beauty of humor too. I mean, when we can laugh at something, we're not attached to an outcome. I mean, laughter's a good policy.
It really is. Anything else you want to share? I know we've covered a lot of ground, but then there's still more to cover. But I think we've at least given it a quick once over.
Yeah, well, just the structure of the book basically is the first two chapters are taking the self and the world that we know apart. The third chapter is, okay, what do we perceive when we do that? The fourth and fifth are kind of, all right, now let's move this in a different direction where we're reassembling in a different way, a different understanding of self. And then the last chapter is about what happens when you come from that different aspect of self. When you're running the Holy Spirit's OS1, how do miracles unfold? And I must admit, in that last one, I did take some liberties, which I've already had people send me some interesting questions. So it'll be really fun when we get to chapter 6 to talk about that, because I think we are all entrapped still by the understanding of miracles as somehow something special.
Mm-hmm.
Ooh, that was a real miracle, rather than, as Miracle Principle 6 says, miracles are natural. When they do not occur, something has gone wrong. In other words, we should be living every day by miracles. And anyway, so that's the trailer. That's the preview of coming attractions.
Perfect.
But we've been through the deconstructing phase, and now we get to kind of start moving in the other direction.
Excellent.
Toward Evermind, away from Nevermind. Thank you, Bruce. This was wonderful again.
Thank you, Bob. Yeah, I really appreciate it, and look forward to the next conversation.
Me too, absolutely.
And you can contact Bob through the Foundation for Inner Peace, acim.org, and I'll post this on acimblog.com, and look forward to the next conversation.
And my website,
yes.
drbob-author.com, drbob-author.com. If you want to read excerpts from the book, if you want to check out my previous book, if you want to check out some novels I wrote back in the 90s that have little to do about the Course, but are heavy on astral projection and fun stuff like that, check out the website.
Very, very good. Thanks for contributing all that you're contributing.
And you too, brother. Thank you.
All righty.
Okay, good.
I think we're good for now, and look forward to the next conversation.
Same. Take care. Blessings.
Alrighty.